Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's an honor to be here at EGA and first time in Australia, but it's wonderful to be here. So I'm here peddling my book. That's why I came all this way. It's called Fellowship of the River. They're selling it over there, down there. I'm signing them, I'm selling them to try to share my experience. Yeah, so I'm a medical doctor. I'm a family medicine doctor. I'm somebody that, I didn't do any slides, but I have a lot of YouTubes out. If you want to see a lot of slides, I have YouTubes with too many slides because, you have too many slides. So I've just come to talk to you. And, I was somebody that got depressed when I was in medical school and had a hard time and ended up exploring with antidepressants. And my dad is a psychiatrist. And then I turned to peyote because I'm from Arizona, and that's a tradition available there through the native tradition, and I had a big healing from that. And then my family, being from Colombia, from South America, I knew about the ayahuasca that they call yahe in Colombia, and I began to become curious about that. And I went down eventually to drink ayahuasca in Peru in the Amazon with Shipibo, one of the tribes some people are aware of, that are kind of sharing their medicine with the world, and this mix of pilgrimage / ayahuasca tourism and all the different ways that goes down. And I had some major experiences, and I started getting more involved, and eventually I helped open a healing center with that shaman under his direction, Ricardo Amaringo. And we treated people there from all over the world in this ayahuasca tourism / now ayahuasca pilgrimage, people coming down for healing. And so the shamans that I work with, very serious individuals, serious members of the tradition. There's a few people here who've been to Niue Rao that are in the room, and we've had a lot of people come from Australia, which is one of the reasons I wanted to come. So I gained a lot of experience there, and then eventually I went through the training myself to do the ayahuasca shamanism in the way that I was trained in Shipibo style. And so that was a big experience that I went through, and so like I was telling someone else, a lot of people ask me, how do you juggle all that, isn't that the big conflict and the academic and the Western and and the shamanism and the energy. And we just had, that was a very interesting discussion, with the acacia and talking about acacia, the plant spirit acacia, from the earth wisdom perspective versus DMT, and the alkaloids and this and that. And that's all you need and that's all you got. And, but meanwhile, it's like, wow, when we lean in, when we learn our science, and we understand the knowledge and we respect and we get what we can get from that, but then we also open ourselves to the ancestral tradition, there's a lot more that can be done. I don't know, I don't want to, but there's a lot of people smoking DMT in the United States, and they're not necessarily achieving what we're achieving. For example, at this ayahuasca healing center where I was working for 6 years, 6 to 8 months living in the jungle and doing this work with people in ceremony over and over and over again, and with access to traditional masters, and to connect to the spirit, the plant spirit, to learn about that and be humble to that and figure out what might be possible that you didn't imagine, because no one had ever guided you to that. That perhaps there are some things that take more than one lifespan to learn, And a simple example is like what's possible. I always bring it up, architecture. Like, wow, this building we're in, they didn't figure it out like on a weekend workshop. They've been working at it, and now we're in this comfortable space. So I think the way to bridge, this Western world and the shamanic world is people. People, that's the way. That's all that's happening anyways. That's the truth of there are some people doing it a lot of different ways, but at least in my experience, as a doctor and people trying to ask me, how do I explain what happened to this person? Well, you have to talk to that person, and they're going to make it very easy for you to understand. If they in fact had a healing experience, then their subjective experience is going to guide a lot of our understanding about what it is that happened. And then we can apply, some of the Western understanding to that story, and we can apply some of the shamanic understanding to that story. So that's the point of what I've tried to put together. And so that's this book, and it's a book about my entrance into that and my journey from medical school into getting deeper in with these shamans in the Amazon, and then starting the healing center, and then watching some people go through these healings. And then drawing upon, from my Western perspective, these bodies of research that are kind of hot topics right now, like psychedelic science, what MAPS is putting out and what people are talking about, all this research that's going on around the psychedelic molecules. And then psychoneuroimmunology and psychoneuroendocrine immunology, this is mind-body medicine research. So I spent a couple of years in that field at UCSD in the Department of Psychiatry and understanding, when all that research around stress and illness, and how does stress lead to disease and how does stress lead to high blood pressure and how are these things connected and how come when people are depressed, their immune system doesn't function as well. And that's all being very well articulated. I talk about this a lot, but there's that whole field of research that's there that's kind of helping us to understand how emotional trauma affects people's physical health, very directly. And then there's epigenetics, so I bring up epigenetics. That's a very interesting area of research that's popping up about how, basically genes are, the expression of genes, not the DNA code itself, but the expression of genes can be modified within the lifespan, So you might have a disease that you think is a genetic disease, but it's actually a software problem. It's not a hardware problem. And how do you manipulate that software? And then there's this research showing, wow, that kind of software responds to psychotherapy. You can show biochemistry changing around genes in response to psychotherapy, to meditation as well, and to nutrition and emotional interactions. In other words, people getting epigenetically imprinted and marked from emotional trauma from their childhood, and that leading to like a lifelong tendency towards certain, physical looking problems. And how can you undo that, and the possible role of, yes, psychedelics facilitating that process, but then a step further, a shamanic tradition taking that even further and showing maybe perhaps how you could heal, all kinds of things. And so I was there and I witnessed as a family medicine doctor these different diseases, things like, and that's what the book tries to touch on, these very, what would, from a Western perspective, would be very different diseases, like migraine headache. Like I say, if I'm family medicine, you do the usual, you give them tryptamines, you give them sumatriptan and stuff like that, so they touch into the tryptamine world, but if they don't get better, you send them to the neurologist. Crohn's disease, inflammatory bowel disease, they pretty much go straight to gastroenterology. The PTSD, they're gonna go to the psychiatrist. I had a chronic cough case. It's unexplained chronic cough. They were at the pulmonologist getting extensively worked out. Somebody else with kind of anxiety, depression, but also struggling with their weight, with back problems and knee problems, was seeing like 3 or 4 specialists to try to address these issues. So you have these very different problems, and then they're all coming down and they're all receiving a very similar Shipibo treatment. Different plants, ayahuasca at the core of their treatment, but everyone is going on to this traditional Shipibo diet, this vegetalista diet, right, with all these restrictions you may have heard about. It's one of the ways to do it. And so it's in our center, it's just no salt, no sugar, no sweets, no oily foods, no hot chili, no dairy, no meat, no sex, no alcohol. Maybe a couple other no's. It's extremely limited and simple and boring. And then you take many of these people that I'm assuming they're also given master plants, from the traditional Amazonian plant medicine tradition that are not necessarily psychoactive at all, that are considered very core to their treatment for spiritual reasons primarily. Not just for, some of them have pharmacologic properties that are acknowledged and recognized, but most of the people I'm describing, a lot of their plants they were taking were being taken for spiritual reasons. Not because they provide visions in any way, but that they could influence the person in this very humble diet, respect-filled period of time, that perhaps that would influence their consciousness through their dreams, through their thoughts, and perhaps enter their ayahuasca ceremony experience. And then they're going through ayahuasca ceremony, 4 times a week, and intensely in a Shipibo style, with receiving healing song from the shamans, the Icaros, right? So that's this additional thing that people are training the Shipibo tradition to learn to connect to the spiritual energy and to transmit that energy in a way that would influence people. And it's out there, it's mystical. But as a doctor and somebody that works there, I've seen a lot of people have a big time response to the songs. And that tradition is about one-on-one singing. It's not just singing and facilitating the group, but it is this psychic surgery kind of approach. And so, being exposed to all that, and I talk about that. And so then this is one thing, when I talk about these different diseases that I just mentioned, what is it that linked those cases? What was it that healed that? Because I'm saying, if the doctor, and they're all getting the same kind of treatment, they're getting plants, they're getting ayahuasca, they're on this diet, they're getting the icaros, they're getting the songs. What is it that they healed? And in every case of those cases, it was deep emotional trauma. It was deep emotional trauma that was underlying this Crohn's disease, that was underlying this migraine headache, that was underlying this PTSD, that was underlying this chronic cough. And once you get at that kind of cause, this energetic causality, and you start approaching that from a spiritual approach, and you start applying, on top of the plants and the ceremony, but the person has to do this work, that some of it's an energetic purge, some release. Some of it is this work around forgiveness, and letting go at a deep soul level in a mystical context. And then they have this shift, they have this change. And so this spiritual context allows for this really deep emotional healing, and then this mind-body starts to heal. The physical symptoms start going away. So, really bad migraines forever. Oh my God, I have migraines. Oh, that's me, I have migraines. That's who I am. Go to the doctor. You have migraines. It's like, I don't have migraines anymore. Not like that anymore. And I already went to all the doctors, and I already went to all that stuff. And I had this chronic cough, and I already had the pulmonology and the CT scan and this and that, and I don't have it anymore. And it was really a matter of my heart that needed to be healed, and this PTSD and all that stuff. And so it's like, that's the kind of medicine that is so impactful. And so that's my purpose, is like, the role of spiritual healing in modern healthcare. And the physicality of it, the physiology of it, the biochemistry of it, that we don't need to keep separating these worlds, what I mean? That it's so different. What do I do with my spiritual life? But I need a job. It's like, well, I guess that's what's going on, everybody. Like, it's a false separation, right? And we know that. So it's this idea that there's this mind-body connection that has been accepted into the Western thinking, mind-body, I can go to the doctor and go to the scientific conference, and mind-body, that's okay. And there's this physiology around mind-body, psychoneuroimmunology, psychoneuroendocrine immunology, the way your psychology and your thinking and your mind affect your brain, and the way that affects your autonomic nervous system, right? Like vagus, somebody was talking to me about, or parasympathetic and sympathetic, all that automatic functioning, your breathing, your sweating, your blood pressure, your heart rate, all these areas where emotion lives and is expressed and exists. And then the way that psychoneuroimmunology connects into your immune system and your white blood cells, and the way they're affected by that, or other parts of your immune system, or the way your hormones are affected by that, cortisol levels, for example. So you see things like PTSD, so then I'm saying, so just to get back to this, the mind-body pair, and then so what's bridging these two things is this psychoneuroendocrine immunologic network. That's the bridge from science, right? But that's the emotional body. That's the emotional body that Chinese medicine has been talking about, and that Ayurveda has been talking about. So that network is this emotional body, and we can show how emotional trauma disturbs the function of that body, and how emotional healing heals that body. So in a PTSD case where you have PNEI networks, the psychology, the constant nightmares, and the trigger happy, anger and fear, and then you have their nervous system that's thrown off with this heart rate problems and blood pressure problems and everything else, and fight or flight problems, and then their adrenal and the cortisol issue and this chronic inflammation. So you see, it's a disease of the emotional body. So diseases of the emotional body, a lot of times, once we rule out the other possibilities and you see, wow, there's multiple elements of the emotional body is disturbed here, then you can see that a lot of times a spiritual approach is the answer to addressing that kind of stuff. So that's the point of the book, is to kind of demonstrate, like, hey, look at these illnesses, look what these people are telling, look at their story. They're describing like basically an emotionally rooted problem. We're beginning to understand the physiology associated with that. And the way out of that was actually a spiritual process that was facilitated by ayahuasca and shamanism and the plant medicines. And so that's a lot of what I want to talk about. And then there's this other part. So this mind body, so the emotion is there, the emotional body is keeping them together, but then from the other traditions we're learning that the emotional body is paired to the energy body. So the emotional body is paired to the energy body. So through the emotion, through our feeling, we access this mystical, right? We have access to this mystical. And so then it's this two-way streak, actually, where I can, through my emotional body, I can feel into the mystical. But if my emotional body is very clogged up and with a lot of baggage, et cetera, I'm going to have a hard time actually reaching into the mystical. If I don't address that, or if my healthcare system doesn't address emotional trauma, it's going to be very hard for my culture to find deeper meaning in life, to find inspiration. It's going to seem very flat, and so I'm going to be stuck with an emotional stuckness that, like, my only option is materialism, to try to change the way I feel through, money or drugs or sex or all these different things, Like, that's how I'm going to try to sort that out. But if I can heal some of that emotional baggage, then I'm going to raise, actually, my mystical awareness. And we see this happen all the time in many circumstances, especially at the Ayahuasca Healing Center, extremely common phenomenon. The atheist that all of a sudden becomes very spiritually interested once they go through this release that it was really their broken heart, is why they couldn't feel into that. And so what's funny about this portal between the emotional body and the energy body, it's a two-way street. So now we can actually approach the emotional body through energetic approaches. And we can do things there. Shamanic healing, okay? That's shamanic healing. And we can see a shift into the emotional body and the subjective experience that leads to a mind-body shift. So they actually have physical, results from that process. So that's the connection in the network. That's one of the things that I talk about. And I'll just finish it off with, just for fun of it, a slight reading. Because it's about, so the book's about, like, it's trying to be stories, to make this information accessible to your parents, to people who don't believe, what are you doing? What are you doing? It's like, it's for that, It's what it is. But it's also like my little journey through it. So it's this first time that I'm supposed to be helping Ricardo, the shaman that I work with, in a ceremony, and I'm like overwhelmed and I don't know what's going on. And so it starts out, after I don't know how long, so he had been singing to me, Ricardo, to open this diet. After I don't know how long, he stopped and punctuated the song with some more shushing exhalations. He finished. My goal was an empty vessel. I could hear the people around me, but I was not sure of much else. Ricardo then said something like, "All right, Joe, let's begin." Begin what? I thought, staring blankly at him in the dark. I realized that the only thing I was clear about was I was not ready to begin anything. I expressed this to him. I told him that I had in fact forgotten everything, including who all of these other people were, and even more confusing, why they were there with us. Calmly, Ricardo told me in Spanish, "Concéntrate." In Spanish, concentration maintains more of its connotation of collecting oneself, not just one's mind. He was asking me to concentrate my being like orange juice, and he also wanted me to focus my mind. I told him that this would not be possible. He simply repeated, "Concéntrate." This happened at least once more, then he changed his approach. He said he would make it easy for me. He asked me simply to take him to the person who was the most ill. "Who is the most ill?" he asked. "Who needs the most help?" He repeated. "Take me to whoever needs the most help. This, I would learn, is the path beyond confusion. Go after what is most obvious." And so then they just have 1 minute left to just get at. So eventually I take him to Russ, this PTSD guy, right? And so Russ is having his experience. And they get into the history of what happened to Russ and what kind of treatment has he had and all this kind of stuff. So I take him over to Russ. As Ricardo and I approached him during that first Spaceship Earth ceremony, that's what we called it, Russ was deep in his ayahuasca experience. He was looking into his body and saw dark black leeches bubbling up to the surface of his skin. They were rising up from out of his stomach and intestines. The ayahuasca was, as the Shipibo say, driving the darkness out of him. Dark leeches were oozing up and then scampering away into multiple directions. Curiously enough, Jared, a crew member sitting next to him on his right, also saw these oozing creatures. This does happen in ayahuasca ceremonies. Sometimes people share the same vision. I sat quietly behind Ricardo, not really sure what was happening. After a bit of observation, Ricardo opened up with a relentless, machine gun style Icaro that seemed to dig deeper and deeper into Russ. Once he started chanting, Russ saw that the leeches went from oozing outward to flying out of his body. As Jared witnessed, it was as if Ricardo was pulling deeper and darker leeches out of Russ's body, some with nails hanging from them. Blue sparks went flying. Jared, a bit terrified by the scene, saw electricity crackling outward. Ricardo continued his painstaking work. Russ sat up on his mat through it all, vomiting intermittently. The shamanic cleansing went on for some time. I just sat back in the dark and tried to collect myself. The Icaro continued for 15 minutes or so, and then things quieted. Russ settled down, and Ricardo was satisfied. Joe, let's continue. And it was time to go to somebody else. And so it was just a kind of healing, and Russ ended up having a major healing through this process. 10 days. Vietnam vet. That means he's 4 decades deep of PTSD. In U.S., we have all this war, all this military. These guys are coming back from Iraq. They're coming back from where, and they're going to a meeting, PTSD group therapy, with a guy that's been there for 40 years. So it was a big deal. So anyways, I think that's my time, and we'll go to questions.
Thanks, Joe. Any questions?
I'm just wondering how long your training was to be able to do this work.
Right. Before I ran my own ceremony, I trained for 5 years. And that was like 6 to 8 months, 4 ceremonies a week. And so I had a very unique opportunity to go intense. And so that's down there, the real Shipibo, the one that we do, it's a year diet. So after a year diet, you could run ceremony as a beginner, but you're regarded as a beginner, and 5 years would be like maybe more appropriate of apprenticeship. To be a beginner, once again, I'm a medical doctor. When you get out of medical training, you're a beginner. No one's that excited about the surgeon that just got out from residency. And that's how it is. And to separate this shamanic, neo-shamanic, new age from that, it's like experience teaches wisdom, Everybody knows that. Go ahead.
Hi, Joe. Firstly, I want to thank you for your work, because I'm someone who has gone to your center in the past and experienced major healing under Ricardo. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
I would have 2 questions, actually. I'll be a little bit greedy. One is to do with integration when you come back into society.
Right.
How would you approach that? Are there any sort of advices that you might have?
Yeah, and so the integration is, again and again, it's looking like an extremely vital piece of the story, right, of the puzzle. We were down there slaving away in the jungle, and sending people off and, wishing them all the best. Like, we didn't even have internet for a period of time. And so it was part of this ayahuasca tourism, this pilgrimage. That's one of the things that people criticize about what's happening. For us, it's illegal in the United States, so we didn't have the opportunity to do it another way. In the book, I try to, because I'm not an integration expert, right? Because I was mostly the ceremonial, pumping it in there. And so then people are going back, and we're encouraging them to find integration. And so in the book, I try to at least follow, several individuals for years, see what happened to them, and who was more successful, and what did they do. And so I find that, integration is very important, and there's a lot of different forms that may be enough for some people. People who had a really nice social network in which they could be open with and talk about their experience with, that was crucial. That was very helpful. Other people needed professional help, or whether it was a life coach that was a consistent support for them, or, therapy. Russ went back and he went to an integrative program at the VA in the United States, the Veterans Administration, that he said he never would have gone to, but he decided to go. He had been to therapy, he didn't like it, and then he went, and now he participated in this integrative program because of the healing he went through ayahuasca. Mike, the cocaine addict in the book, relapsed until he stabilized in AA when he was home. And that was really important for him to do that. So I think there's just ongoing support socially. Could be professional, could be groups. We do integration groups with people that we work with.
Hi, thanks so much for being so incredibly articulate, and what you've been saying so far has deeply resonated with my beliefs and values, so thank you.
Thank you.
My question is just people who may need help because of their destructive patterns of behaviour, but they don't necessarily seek that help.
Right.
Do you ever find people coming to your ceremonies who are in denial or something like that, rather than those who are really seeking help.
Right. Yeah, we do. We do. It's obviously it's a far distance to go into the jungle, and so a lot of people are quite committed, to be there. But there are those that are committed but still resisting and fighting us, and this whatever, resisting the experience. And so with the issue of the Holocaust survivors, and then there's that's the epigenetic thing that's very interesting, this ancestral trauma. And so one approach, a lot of times in the spiritual shamanic approach, is through the family. So doing healing work through family members, through individuals, work on your parents through you, work on your children through you as one approach. And some of the healing that comes out of that for you might lead to an opening and a conversation down the line with them. This just happened, I was in an ayahuasca ceremony not too long ago. And somebody who has a lot of issues speaking with their father, there's some friction, conflict, can't put their finger on it. And then it showed them this whole experience that the dad went through when he almost died of diverticulitis, and how terrified he wasn't going to be there for his kids. And it was so deep, and he had such a compassion with the experience. So he's telling me this, and this is the integration and the ayahuasca homework. It's different for everybody. You can't write. But I just said, hey, you can't really talk to your dad. Why don't you talk to him about that? You don't tell him you dreamed it if you don't want to tell him you drank ayahuasca. But that's just something, that moment, you experienced that moment that he went through, and it was, whoa, it seems so intense. And see if that opens up a little channel for you to talk to him now.
Please thank Dr. Joe once again.
Thank you. I got books. There's books.